Section 17 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian von Diedenroth. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Section 17, Chapter 10, Hampton Roads, Part 1. The Coming of Steam and Armored Navies, the Fight in Hampton Roads. March, 1862. Trafalgar was the greatest fight of the sailing ships. There were later engagements, which were fought under sail, but no battle of such decisive import. It was a fitting close to a heroic era in the history of naval war. A period of not much more than 4 centuries in thousands of years. Before it came the long ages in which the fighting ship depended more upon the oar than the sail, or on the oar exclusively. After it came our present epoch of machine-propelled warships, bringing with it wide-sweeping changes in construction, armament, and naval tactics. Inventive pioneers were busy with projects for the coming revolution in naval war while Nelson was still living. The Irish-American engineer Fulton had tried to persuade Napoleon to adopt steam propulsion, and had astonished the Parisians by showing them his little steamer making its way up the Seine with clumsy paddles churning up the waters and much sooty smoke pouring from its tall, thin funnel. The Emperor thought it was a scientific toy. Old admirals, most conservative of men, declared that a gunboat with a few long sweeps, or oars, would be a handier fighting ship in a calm. And if there was any kind of wind, a spread of sail was better than all the Americans' tea-kettle devices. Fulton went back to America to run passenger steamers on the Hudson, and tell unbelieving commodores and captains that the future of the sea power lay with the tea-kettle ships. In the days of the long peace that followed Waterloo, and the great industrial development that came with it, the steam engine and the paddle steamer made their way into the commercial fleets of the world, slowly and timidly at first, for it was a long time before a steamship could be provided with enough efficient engine power to enable her to show the way to a smart, clipper-built sailing ship, and the early marine engines were fearfully uneconomical. Steam had obtained a recognized position in small ships for short voyages, ferry boats, river steamers, and coasting craft, but on the open ocean the sailing ship still held its own. An eminent scientist proved the demonstration that no steamship would ever be able to cross the Atlantic under steam alone. He showed that to do so, it would be necessary for her to carry a quantity of coal exceeding her entire tonnage capacity. And he expressed his readiness to eat the first steamer that made the voyage from Liverpool to New York. But he lived to regret his offer. In 1838, the Great Western and the Sirius inaugurated the steam passenger service across the Atlantic, and the days of the liner began. By this time, paddle-wheel gunboats were finding their way into the British Navy, and other powers were beginning to follow the example of England. Steamships were first in action in 1840, when Sir Charles Napier employed them side by side with sailing ships that had shared the triumphs of Nelson. This was in the attack on Acre, when England intervened to check the revolt of the Pasha of Egypt, Ibrahim, against his suzerain, the Sultan. But still the steamship was regarded as an auxiliary. The great 3-decker battleships, the smart sailing frigates, were the main strength of navies. The paddle steamer was a defective type of warship, because her paddle boxes and paddle wheels and her high-placed engines presented a huge target singularly vulnerable. A couple of shots might disable in a minute her means of propulsion. True, she had masts and sails, but if she could not use her engines, the paddles would prove a drag upon all her movements. It was the invention of the screw propeller that made steam propulsion for warships really practical. Brunel was one of the greatest advocates of the change. He was a man who was in many ways before his time, and he had to encounter a more than unusual amount of official conservatist obstruction. For years, the veteran officers who advised the Admiralty opposed and ridiculed the invention. When at last it was fitted to a gunboat, the Rattler, it was obvious that it provided the best means of applying steam propulsion to the purposes of naval war. The propeller was safe under water, and the engines could be placed low down in the ship. By 1854, when the Crimean War began, both the British and French navies possessed a number of steam-propelled line-of-battle ships, frigates, and gunboats fitted with the screw. They had also some old paddle ships, but in the fleets dispatched to the Baltic and the Black Sea, there were still a considerable number of sailing ships, and a fleet still did most of its work under sail. Even the steamships had only what we should now describe as auxiliary engines. The most powerful line of battleships in the British Navy had engines of only 400 to 600 horsepower. With such relatively small power, they still had to depend chiefly on their sails. Tugboats were attached to the fleets to tow the sailing ships when the steamships were using their engines. Another change was taking place in the armament of warships and coast defenses. The rifled cannon was still in the experimental stage, but explosive shells, which in Nelson's days were only fired from mortars at very short range, had now been adapted to guns mounted on the broadside and the coast battery. Solid shot were still largely used, but the coming of the shell meant that there would be terrible loss in action in the crowded gun decks, and inventors were already proposing that ships should be armored to keep these destructive missiles from penetrating their sides. The attack on the sea front of Sebastopol by the Allied fleets on 17 October 1854 was the event that brought home to the minds of even the most conservative the necessity of a great change in warship construction. It rang the knell of the old wooden walls and led to the introduction of armor-clad navies. The idea of protecting ships from the fire of artillery and musketry by iron plating was an old one, and the wonder is that it did not much earlier receive practical application. The Dutch claim to have been the pioneers of ironclad building more than 300 years ago. During the famous siege of Antwerp by the Spaniards in 1585, the people of the city built a huge, flat-bottomed warship, armored with heavy iron plates, which they named the Finis Belli, a boastful expression of the hope that she would end the war. An old print of the Finis Belli shows a four-masted ship with a high poop and a forecastle, but with a low freeboard amidships. On this lower deck, taking up half the length of the ship, is an armored citadel with portholes for 4 heavy guns on each side. The roof of the citadel has a high bulwark, loopholed for musketry. On 3 of the masts there were also crow's nests or round tops for musketeers. Heavily weighted with her armor, the ship had a deep draught of water, and probably steered badly. In descending the Scheldt to attack the Spaniards, she ran aground in a hopeless position under their batteries, and fell into the hands of the Spanish commander, the Duke of Parma. He kept the Finis Belli as a curiosity till the end of the siege, and then had her dismantled. If she had scored a success, armored navies would no doubt have made their appearance in the 17th century.